X-Men First Class, directed by Matthew Vaughn, starring James McAvoy, Michael Fassbender, Jennifer Lawrence, and a huge amount of other people. Taking place in the early 1960s during one of the heights of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Charles Xavier teams up with Eric Lenscher to track down this mutant, Sebastian Shaw, played by Kevin Bacon, to stop him from causing a nuclear holocaust on the whole world, leading to a clashing of ideologies between the two lead characters. And before you guys start asking, yes, I did review the first X-Men last year, and here we are a year later talking about the prequel, X-Men First Class. Well, shouldn't you be talking about the second one? I figured maybe since it's about 10 years old now, we're just past the 10-year anniversary mark a couple months ago, and considering that the Marvel multiverse is now a thing and the pandemic hasn't exactly been time favorable, especially in light of how screwed up the continuity became in the X-Men franchise, what better way to talk about X-Men First Class than here? I have seen X-Men First Class a couple of times, and the general vibe that I get is that it's very underrated by a lot of people, and for some people it's their favorite in the franchise, and I could kind of see why, but I honestly never was a huge fan of this one, as opposed to some of the other ones. And I'll explain in more detail here, but I feel like something was missing in this one. Save for McAvoy and Fassbender's performances, it doesn't have that emotional gravitas that the original two, or X-Men Days of Future Past have, or even Logan for that matter. And I'm not in any way trying to knock this movie just for the sake of going against the grain. I'm not saying anything bad against these actors, except for maybe one, which we'll talk about later. But there are good aspects to this movie, as I'll talk about throughout this video. So I would say it's not bad, it's fine. It gets the job done, it has its place in the franchise. I just don't really think it's as good as a lot of people say it is. The opening sequence that we get with young Eric Lenscher in the Holocaust camp where he's taken away from his mother, it's basically the same scene, almost verbatim, from the original X-Men film, except we get a bit more detail and more in-depth look about what happened with Eric and how he dealt with the loss of his mother at the hands of Sebastian Shaw, which gives you a good reason to care about Magneto despite him going about his cause in the wrong way. Shaw, played by Kevin Bacon, wants to use young Eric as a science experiment because of the mutation in his DNA. So he kills Eric's mother, and in a fit of rage and pain, Eric lashes out, causing all the metal in the room to come crashing down. And the intro we get for a young Charles Xavier when he first meets Mystique, or Raven. Raven's disguised as Charles' mom, but due to his telepathic abilities, he's able to figure out what's going on, and he takes her under his wing as his friend. Fast forward to years later in 1962, Charles Xavier is graduating from Oxford University and becomes a professor. We actually get a really unique look at Charles Xavier as a character. And I'm not someone who's read the X-Men comics. I have a couple in my room upstairs, but I never really have gone out of my way to read them. I'm a very slow reader, so take from that what you will. But having talked with other comic book fans, I know enough about this character to know that it was a very different take on Charles Xavier, because in the original films, he was very serious and very calm and level-headed, played superbly by Patrick Stewart as well. Here, Charles is very young and free and full of life, and he's out drinking with his buddies, having a good time, and trying to win the charms of any woman that he sees. It's a very groovy mutation, I must say. And some people might prefer James McAvoy as Xavier as opposed to Patrick Stewart, or vice versa. I don't necessarily have a preference either or, because I think they're both equally as good as this character, that you could kind of pick your poison either way. Same thing with Fassbender versus McKellen as Magneto. And Eric Lenscher is on a mission to hunt for Sebastian Shaw as he travels throughout Europe and Argentina looking for these two German guys living in Argentina who I'm assuming exiled into South America after the Nuremberg trials took place, and ruthlessly kills the two of them in a bar, and the bartender as well. Practically chill-inducing the way Fassbender carries himself out, especially when he removes that tooth from that banker in Switzerland. Michael Fassbender, I would have to say, is one of the best actors in the business right now. I first saw him in Band of Brothers, where he played Bert Christensen. He had a very small part in that series. Even James McAvoy had a small part in one episode as well of that series. And I love Ian McKellen as Magneto, don't get me wrong, but Michael Fassbender, I don't know if you could have chosen anybody else to play a younger counterpart. There's so much emotion and pain that's underneath the surface of this character that Michael Fassbender is able to convey it so subtly and so beautifully at the same time. A world of pain is seeping underneath him, and especially in the training sequence where Charles teaches Eric how to move the satellite dish towards them, finding that common ground between serenity and rage, or whatever he says in that scene. And just like in the originals, Magneto's motivations for being a villain, even though we as the audience recognize that he's doing it in a very bad way, it's completely understandable why he's doing it. All he saw was the worst of humanity, as opposed to Charles, who sees the best in humanity. And Magneto, as a result, has this intense hatred towards humans that he just can't let go of. And as for Marvel villains in general, I love Loki, I love Thanos, but I'm going out on a limb here. And you could kill me for saying this, but Magneto, I think, is the best Marvel villain of all time, because of his motivations and his backstory and the emotional weight that's boiling under the surface with him. Disagree with me all you want, but that's how I feel. And seeing the genesis of the friendship/rivalry between Xavier and Magneto is very fascinating, and they obviously come from very different walks of life, but Charles feels a great amount of sympathy for Eric since he was able to see inside his mind and understand where his past hurts come from losing his mom and being a prisoner in the Holocaust. And throughout the film, he tries to reason with Eric and vice versa, trying to persuade the other to see the world from their own eyes. But just like in the originals, it's a very subtle exploration of those ideologies. Neither one preaches towards the other. There's no big speech that happens, even though there is kind of a speech at the climax of the movie with Magneto. But I think it's done in a way that comes off as realistic and grounded instead of heavy-handed. As for the other actors, it's a little hit and miss for me. The scenes between Hank and Raven, played by Nicholas Hoult and Jennifer Lawrence, very tender and very sweet. And this moment in particular where Hank is hanging upside down from that model,
you're amazing.
very similar to a moment in a movie that came out 9 years prior. I just like to imagine myself in Nicholas Holt's shoes, personally. Now, as for Jennifer Lawrence, you guys know how I feel about her. She's my personal favorite actress and my future wife. No, I'm just saying, oh God. Oh boy, I'm not gonna get through this part. Okay, all jokes aside, at this point in her career, she was already Oscar nominated for Winter's Bone, so with her already established notoriety, she decided to go with something a little more lighter, and she watched the X-Men films in order to prepare for this part and went through an 8-hour makeup process in every scene where she had the full body, blue paint, similar to Rebecca Romijn in the original. As a character herself, Raven is not quite as interesting as she is in the sequel, X-Men Days of Future Past. And again, this is the genesis of the X-Men, so you kind of have to take that into account. And I think Jennifer Lawrence is good in this movie. The emotional punch is there and it's good, especially when she gets really fed up with Charles about how controlling he is towards her. And we as the audience do understand her frustration, and she starts to see things from Magneto's perspective as he starts to get his claws into her in some ways. Charles is unable to empathize with Raven's situation since she has to hide from other people. He doesn't have to because all of his abilities are up here in his head. But it's really Magneto who gets her to come to terms with not hiding and being comfortable in her own skin. Especially in the scene where she's laying in bed and he says, "I prefer the real Raven." I said I prefer the real Raven.
Perfection.
Also with a cameo from Rebecca Romijn herself, which I thought was a nice little touch. And how many memes did that scene create? Way too much. And as for cameos, we get another great cameo as well from you-know-who.
Excuse me, I'm Eric Lensher.
Charles Xavier.
Go f yourself.
And I like seeing how Eric and Charles are recruiting all these different mutants across the country, like Darwin, played by Eddie Gathegi, Angel, played by Zoe Kravitz, who's actually going to be Selena Kyle in the upcoming Batman movie with Robert Pattinson soon, and other people like Banshee and Alex Summers, who is Cyclops' brother. And the training sequence that we get where we see Hank running at a fast distance, beating Charles, seeing Banshee get the hang of flying with the supersonic sound that he's able to emit. It's one of the best sequences in the movie for me. As for other characters, we get Agent Moira McTaggart, played by Rose Byrne, who is pretty standard and basic. There's not a whole lot to her as a character. She's someone who's very determined to stop the Soviets causing a nuclear war and stopping Sebastian Shaw, and the common interest in mutation that she shares with Charles, leading to that romantic gesture at the end, is actually kind of heartbreaking, especially in light of X-Men Apocalypse. That's a whole nother discussion entirely. Not much to her as a character, unfortunately, and I kind of wish that we had more time with her. And that's probably the biggest problem I have. Every single character outside of Eric, Charles, Raven, and Hank, there's not a whole lot to them that makes them more memorable, like in the originals at least. More or less the same problem in the original, yeah, there's not much backstory for each character. And that's the problem with an X-Men movie, I think. You focus on these other people, but the others don't really get much attention. We know now that it's possible in light of all the Avengers films, but at this point in time, the Avengers hadn't come out yet, so again, you gotta take that into account. The other characters outside of the 4 main ones that I mentioned, they're not really that memorable, and they're actually kind of boring and forgettable. The actors play their parts fine, but they don't really do a whole lot but show off their powers in some way, which is cool to see, but still, they're not that interesting in my book. And as for Sebastian Shaw, played by Kevin Bacon, who is a fine actor, don't get me wrong, he's a good motivator for Eric Lensher to get revenge and going about his cause in the way that he sees fit. But he has the same ideology that Magneto ends up using. We never really know where it comes from and why. Kevin Bacon plays the part fine, but there's really not much going on there. As far as his henchman, Azazel, he's got some cool scenes, especially with all of us who have at least some knowledge of the X-Men comics. The father of Nightcrawler, as he conceived a child with Raven later on. The first time I saw this movie, when he started teleporting, it was about 8 years ago or 9 years ago when I started watching these movies for the first time, the moment he started teleporting, I thought, wait, that's like Nightcrawler. And I said to a friend of mine at the time that I was serving in the military with who was also an X-Men fan, is he related to Nightcrawler? And he said, he is. And I said, I thought so. But then there's Emma Frost, played by January Jones. I don't have anything against her as an actress or as a person. I haven't really seen her in other stuff. She might be good in other things that she's been in. I hate to say this. She was really bad in this one. Her performance is just so bland and stoic and robotic. That's all I have to say about that. And that's intertwined with the big problem I have with this movie. It doesn't feel as strong from an emotional standpoint like the original did. Matthew Vaughn gets the job done. I know that he is very capable since I have seen Kingsman: The Secret Service, so he knows how to put some good energy into a film and make it feel like it's warranted. But here, I think it's more of the writing of the characters, or maybe it's the direction, I'm not really sure. It doesn't feel quite as strong as I think it could have been. And there's some discrepancies that are taken with the X-Men continuity. Like, Charles supposedly originally created Cerebro, as they say in the original, but in this one, it's Hank that creates it. Now, inevitably, they created a new timeline in Days of Future Past, so by then, I don't think it really mattered that much, but still, if you're someone who pays attention to the details, it's gonna drive you crazy, and it kind of drove me a little bit crazy too, but since this franchise is over and done with, it's not nearly as obnoxious. And as far as the setting of the early 1960s, it utilizes that era fairly well, although I think it comes off a little too clean and too James Bond-like, especially in the scene where Eric has to interrogate that banker in Switzerland. I mean, this is the early 1960s when the James Bond franchise started, so no surprise there. But in some ways it feels a bit too modern for my liking, where it looks like it could take place in the year 2011 or 2021 or whatever, especially with some of the clothing. It doesn't feel always like the 1960s for me. I don't know if I'm alone in that or if that makes any sense to anybody, but that's how I've always felt. And the score by Henry Jackman has some decent pieces of music, but it's not nearly as captivating as John Ottman's score in the original. I'm trying not to compare and contrast too much to the original, but knowing how good the X-Men movies were, or at least some of them were, I kind of expect more out of some of my X-Men movies. This one is not awful. It's not awful by any means. I just think that it could have been better than it turned out to be. Inevitably, everything comes to a head in the Cuban Missile Crisis when Shaw and his group take over a Russian vessel that's about to cross the quarantine blockade line, and they manage to avert nuclear war, and there's a big showdown that happens in the submarine, but Magneto ends up killing Shaw instead out of revenge, and takes Shaw's helmet, which he ends up adapting into his Magneto helmet, and it leads to probably the most riveting scene in the film, with both the Soviet and US navies out there with their guns pointed right at them.
Thousands of men on those ships, good, honest, innocent men. They're just following orders.
I've been at the mercy of men just following orders. Never again.
Another great example of the clashing of ideologies between the two characters, where you completely understand where each one's coming from. But unfortunately, it leads to Charles being paralyzed accidentally by Eric when Taggart fires a couple of bullets at him, and both Charles and Eric come to realize and accept that they're not on the same page, and Raven decides to join Eric's side. The humans have played their hand, now we get ready to play ours. No more hiding. By the way, Hank's beast look in this movie, just plain awful. And his mouth movements don't sync up at all with what he's saying when we first see him as Beast.
Of course I can. I designed it.
X-Men First Class is not a bad movie or a great movie necessarily, it's just fine. It's not awful, but it's not bad. But the best part of this movie, and what really makes me want to come back to it every once in a while, is the interplay between Charles and Eric and the performances from Fassbender and McAvoy. Very faithful to what the X-Men is really all about, prejudice and racism and the clashing of ideologies between the two. And both sides are very understandable in where they're coming from. And the fact that McAvoy and Fassbender are friends in real life, that just makes their friendship in the movie even better. And 3 years later, it led to a fantastic sequel, which is my personal favorite in the X-Men franchise. But we'll save that for another time. Those are my thoughts on X-Men First Class. What are your guys' thoughts on the movie? Comment below and tell me, and I'll see you guys in the next video.